and welcome to episode 11 of the Crime and Punishment Recap series. We're continuing with the industrial period in these videos. However, now we are looking at what change and continuity there was in law enforcement in the industrial period. In terms of continuity then, in 1750 you largely still have the same amateur part-time officials that you did in the previous time periods. For example, the parish constable and the watchman in towns, but of course these often had limited success because they were not well trained at their jobs and they were therefore not very effective at them. Another example of continuity that you get at this time period is in the courts. Courts largely stayed the same throughout this time period. For example, you still have assizes for serious crimes and you also have court sessions for some serious and also petty crimes. However, trials are longer and more formal during this time period, and that's because there's the introduction of real evidence for the first time, which lengthens the court process. However, the industrial period is a time of very significant change in terms of law enforcement. Because you have rapid growth in towns and cities such as London, where you get a high population, a migrant influx and high poverty rates, it forces the authorities' hand and makes them change law enforcement to deal with this growing crime. So, for the first time, you get a group called the Bow Street Runners, established by Sir John Fielding in the 1750s, and it's the first time that we have paid constables to patrol the streets. By 1800, you get 68 men, which is a very significant number because, like I said, it's the first time ever that we're paying our law enforcement officials to do their job. It's their full-time job. However, the Bow Street Runners are still considered too expensive and too radical for the whole country. However, in 1773, Sir John Fielding does start to publish information about crime rates for the first time in a magazine called The Hue and Cry. There's lots of opposition to a national police force, largely due to cost, but Robert Peel, who is the Home Secretary, does manage to overcome this opposition. And in 1829 he establishes the Metropolitan Police Force, and this creates 3,000 paid constables in blue uniforms. They wore blue because the army wore red at the time, and the councils and the government did not want the people of London and England to worry that the police force were just armed men used by the government to put down protests. The police are supposed to be different. Once the police are set up in London, they do start to slowly spread throughout the country, and that's through a series of laws that are passed throughout the 1800s. You get the 1835 Municipal Corporations Act, which tries to encourage towns to get a police force, but only 100 out of 178 choose to do so, largely because of the costing of this. 4 years later, in 1839, you get the Rural Constabulary Act, which tries to allow counties as a whole to establish a police force, but again, only 2/3 do due to the rising costs of a police force. They still don't have the money to do this. A few years later, in 1856, you get the County and Borough Act, which is the first step towards establishing a national police force like we have today. And the government also provide half of the funding by the 1870s. So the government are trying to alleviate some of the costs of having these paid constables to patrol the streets, because the government are starting to recognise that they are effective at preventing crime and dealing with rising crime rates. You also get a change in the police force itself. So after the police is set up, the police start to evolve rapidly throughout this time. In the 1850s, their main job is still to clamp down on offensive behaviour, for example being drunk and disorderly, but they now are also used to prevent theft and violence itself. That becomes their main job as the 1800s progress. So it's the first time that we have law enforcement officials capable of preventing crime before it even occurs. And this therefore leads to a fall in crime rates from the 1850s, like we talked about in the crime video prior to this one. You get further developments in the police force, like I've said. So, for example, you get the Criminal Investigation Department in 1878, which sets up 800 detectives to go and solve crimes around the country. In the 1880s, detectives use photographs of crime scenes for the first time to help provide evidence in courts. They're making use of that growing technology towards the end of the industrial period. In 1867, the telegraph is used to speed up communication between different police departments, so it helps relay messages more quickly. And in 1897, right at the end, fingerprinting is used at the first time. So it's the first time that we can match fingerprints of criminals to those found at crime scenes, again to use as evidence in court. So this is a huge development in law enforcement, one that we hadn't really seen before, because it's the first time that we get a professional and a paid police force that were non-existent really in the other two time periods. And it is also the first time period in which the law enforcement is there to try and prevent crime from occurring. Before, in medieval and early modern Britain, the authorities had relied on extremely punitive and harsh punishments to try and stop growing crime rates, but now it's the law enforcement's job. So that wraps up law enforcement in industrial Britain. The next video will focus on the changing punishments during this time.